programs with contract values in excess of $50 million. He also built and managed over $20 million of annual revenue in programs as technical director and vice president of product development, respiratory management division, medical countermeasures, and diagnostic groups. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Harris.
Andrew, thanks for the kind introduction. And so anyways, I just want to thank the Ithaca College Chemistry Department, faculty and students for inviting me to talk today. And so I'll go, like I say, at some point here, I need to figure out how to switch over the slides, but what I hope to do is really take you through a scientific journey, as the title says, from the farm to the hill and our nation's capital. So I'm very excited to discuss some highlights of my career, which probably are considered fairly non-traditional. And if you ask, especially Glenn Vogel, Dr. Vogel, and other friends and colleagues, they'll say I'm a pretty non-traditional guy, and that's just kind of the way I grew up. So with that, I'm going to try to figure out how to get the actual presentation up here. Bear with me. That'll work just fine. Okay, well, with that, again, I'm said, hope to share this interesting scientific journey, at least for myself, from kind of where I grew up on the farm to, again, the hill and our nation's capital, where I was fortunate enough to brief several Congress people, senators and congressmen. And so with that, can you go to the next slide, Jamie, and I'll go through the overview of the talk here. Thank you. So like I said, I'm going to go a little bit over my personal background, kind of career highlights, which are mostly with MRI Global, which was called the Midwest Research Institute, and changed our name 7-8 years ago. I'll go through several of the government program areas I worked in. You'll see that the government loves to use acronyms, so I'll define these as we go through. And then talk a little bit about some of the industrial programs I had the opportunity to work on, mostly in the pharmaceutical industry and agriculture. And then touch a little bit in the end on some government intelligence programs. Can't say a lot, obviously, about those because most of the things I worked on required secret or top secret clearance, and I just can't share all the details. But some overviews I think that will be somewhat interesting, and hopefully time for questions. So Jamie, you're going to have to keep me on time. I had, I can use a stopwatch here and keep myself sort of in check when it comes to timing, but you're going to have to kind of push me along and just say, move on. So on the next slide, like I said, I'm going to start with the farm. And here is it's an aerial photo. I apologize a little bit for the quality of the photo. As you imagine, years ago, it was hard to get aerial photos very clear. And so this is the best that could be done back in that time. But we had two farms in central New York State, both had a larger dairy farm and then a smaller farm. And we, in addition to dairy, we had other animals, hogs and chickens and the typical farm animals you'd see in central New York State, and trying to deal with the rocky soil, which was always a challenge to grow things. But my father was kind of an entrepreneur. And so I'll share a couple stories as I go through the day here. But when I was a young teenager, he said, "Oh yeah, I think it's time for you to learn how to make some money and kind of put some more food on the table." So he said, "You're going to raise some chickens." So he came home with 100 chicks, 50 pullets, 50 males, roosters. And so there I went and started raising them. So when I got the eggs, obviously we used them, and then I sold some. But when Sunday dinner time came, he handed me the axe and said, "Okay, it's time for Sunday dinner, and go do what you need to do." And so as a young kid, that was an interesting experience. But fast forward to my graduate school days, I did a little work with rats and mice. And so, and you can leave it on the last slide, but that's okay. And so he actually, when I got to grad school, I was the guillotine man for the rats. And so again, that tells you pretty well how I took the experience on the farm and fast forward to a graduate school experience that no one else really wanted to do that, but I didn't have a problem. So anyway, so from there, again, you can go to the next slide. So I actually went to Green Central High School, and I think that, there's a fair other of chemistry, and, both chemistry and other students went to Ithaca College. And I was fortunate to have a great high school chemistry and physics teacher, Linda Hughes, who actually went to Ithaca College in the chemistry department and majored there. And she's really, I have to give her a lot of kudos for facilitating me getting into Ithaca College's chemistry department, and with an excellent scholarship. So again, I have to give her a lot of thanks. And the photos here, you see that, I don't have to tell you how beautiful Ithaca College surroundings is or are. And again, you got to thank Glenn Vogel for these great photos. He's always sending me some great videos and photos, even most of the times through the week. And so the only thing I have to say here is that you can note we were pretty snazzy dressers back then, and I think the only thing I can say is my pants and my hat matched. But Ithaca College, I was, again, a great opportunity for me to mature, coming from a small town and grow intellectually. I actually got to be an RA in the dorms, a resident assistant. And so, there were a few times where I had to break up fights between the football players and baseball players, and, just kind of trained me how to deal with staff when I had staff reporting to me in larger numbers. So anyways, so with that, I'll move on to the next slide, which is kind of just a little bit of information about Penn State University, where I went to get my PhD in chemistry, organic chemistry. And you can see that from the photo of the library there's a lot of snow there. So it wasn't much different than Ithaca, especially this year. I know you guys have gotten hammered, but, and I was able to, again, go to a few football games. On the graduate school salary, there's not a lot of things you do, but football was fairly reasonably priced endeavor. And I, from a financial standpoint, food, I have to admit, I became one of the best hamburger helper, people that make hamburger help when there's something really pretty cool. So I worked with Dr. Gordon Hamilton, who is a very highly recognized enzyme mechanistic researcher. And my thesis, most of what I did was related to insulin metabolism. So I did some basic identification of insulin metabolites in various tissues, and then looking at inhibition of enzymes by oxalothioesters. So again, it was a great experience for me. And the last photo, you notice down there, is that that's a photo of myself and Dr. Glenn Vogel and his wife, Kathy, and my wife, Diane. And we were fortunate to hook up at some games in Illinois and Iowa. And I have to really give kudos and a lot of thanks to Glenn. Glenn was a great mentor for me as an undergraduate, and even through graduate school, and even through today. I have to admit, he's a great friend. And so much so that when I was there at Penn State, he came and did a sabbatical. He did do a little research as well as I was, but we did spend a little time playing intramural basketball and football together. So imagine that. Glenn's not competitive, nor am I. So with, you can go to the next slide. So right straight out of graduate school, I actually went to a company called Midwest Research Institute, now called MRI Global. And it was great timing for me. It was in the mid 80s, because the pharmaceutical industry was, seeing a lot of opportunities for expansion. And so I looked at the pharmaceutical industry as directly, companies like Abbott and whatnot, but this research institute, it's an independent, not-for-profit organization. What that means is that any kind of profit that's made goes back into the organization, funding internal research programs or buying new equipment or building new laboratories. And anyways, it's very exciting. And so in that, and they did a lot of applied research, which really, for me, was very exciting. And then it was a lot of work. I mentioned, as I've talked, we'll go through today, we did a lot of work for the government, but also for industry. And I was fortunate to be involved in all those. And if you ever heard of Stanford Research Institute, MRI is very similar to Stanford Research Institute, which is a spinoff, obviously, of Stanford University. And I started out as a bench chemist at MRI, and then just was fortunate enough to move into higher technical positions and then into what we call program management, running some large programs like you mentioned, I think, and did in the $50 million programs, and then I transitioned really into technical management and had well over 100 staff at one point in time. And then finally moved into corporate management in a technical role, and then finally in sales and marketing as the introduction mentioned. So if you want to go to the next slide, Jamie. So these are the major research markets now that MRI is really focusing on: counter weapons of mass destruction, in vitro diagnostics, and medical countermeasures, clinical research support, and then infectious disease and biological threats. And then the management and operations, I won't really get into today, that we actually manage what's called the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado since the 70s. So it's a large operation, about anywhere from 300 million to $500 million a year, depending on how they're funded. But anyways, it's a very diverse, I probably ought to explain medical countermeasure. That's maybe kind of a, what the heck is that? It's basically where we're involved in helping develop treatments for troops. For instance, if troops are exposed to something like sarin or mustard gas, we have helped in development of some of the actual therapies, treatments for the soldiers if they're exposed. I think just recently, it's probably mentioned, is the first treatment for mustard gas exposure to be approved by the FDA. One of the countermeasures they have, it's using what's called the animal models, and I won't get into it because it'd be one of those things makes things more confusing at this point in time. But it's again quite a feat to and an honor for folks who have been working in those areas. So with that, you can go on to the next slide. And this slide is really gives an idea of kind of how MRI fits into the technology spectrum. And if you look at basic research that's going on in universities and some of the federal labs, and even some industrial labs that are developing drugs, MRI kind of inches into that basic research space, but really is more in the applied and development, and sometimes small scale production, which I'll get into later, where we have done small scale drug production and other things to help with a variety of both industrial as well as government client requirements. So, and again, it was, I hadn't mentioned it, but it was founded back in 1944. So we're pretty just celebrated their 75th anniversary recently. So if you want to go on to the next slide, this just is kind of shows what the types of work that was going on at MRI through the years. And it started out, like I said, in the 40s. And at the time of the war, World War II, they came out and there was a lot of ammonium nitrate available and from the war efforts. And so MRI was first involved in pelletizing, coming up with a ammonium nitrate fertilizer for a Spencer Chemical Company based in Kansas City. And you move into the 50s, and I'm sure there are very few people that know this, but if you all know what an M&M is, an M&M candy that doesn't melt in your mouth, well, MRI developed that candy coating that doesn't melt in your hand, and it was actually for the Mars Candy Company. Again, we don't really get a chance to really brag too much about it, other than verbally, but we can say the Mars Company holds that fairly proprietary. And then we were involved in the 60s in some basically design projects, and then 70s. I mentioned this when we picked up the big contract with what was originally called the Solar Energy Research Institute, now called the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And that's continued to grow over the years. And like I said, it's pretty close to, I think it's around 400 million thereabouts most years now. And it'll be interesting to see what happens under the new administration now, funding for that facility gets taken care of. So in the 80s, which is, again, I came to MRI in 1986, that's where we really got a lot more traction in the health arena and studies from cancer and AIDS drugs. And then in the 90s, we kind of go back to some of the engineering things. Our engineering department developed a thermoelectric cooling system. These vests actually hold suits based on the Peltier effect that allowed the astronauts to be cooled as they entered back into the Earth's atmosphere. And then actually that same technology was used to for Apache helicopter pilots and during some of the efforts, war efforts in Iraq and Iran. And then you get to the 2000s, with some of the war efforts, a lot of the war efforts going on, we got into endeavor where we built mobile laboratories. And these were laboratories that would assess what's called CBRNE threats. That's the acronym: chem, bio, radio, nuclear, and explosive threats to our troops. And MRI built those laboratories, deployed them with staff in those war zones. So you can imagine that our folks were, again, it's putting their lives in danger for the benefit of our troops in those war zones. And then the 2010s, and obviously, we looked at, we were very involved in the Ebola outbreak, and now again, currently they're very involved in the COVID, both testing and as well as looking at therapies for the COVID virus challenge we're experiencing. So with that, I guess we can go on to the next slide. And so I'm going to, again, kind of spend a little more detail. Go ahead.
We have about like 12 to 15 minutes till somebody's going to have to sign out. I think other people can stay on. All
right. Well, I'm going to, again, I will take that into consideration. So anyway, so getting into government programs, I have to admit that I've, again, people hear, oh, the government employees, and a lot of, give them a lot of grief. But I tell you, I've worked with a lot of some of the smartest and really great clients in the government, and many of them actually in some of the programs, they've risked their lives. And I've worked with people actually who've lost their lives. So I'm really proud, kind of as a patriotic guy to have worked in that space. So I'm going to, again, so let's go to the next slide. And so a lot of the institutes I worked with were based in the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health. I won't read all the information here. Some of you know about it, but one of the programs I worked on, I would describe briefly, are with the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, the National Cancer Institute, and the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. So go to the next slide. The National Toxicology Program was really sprang out of the National Cancer Institute's efforts back in the 70s. And MRI's been working on it for over 40 years. I haven't personally worked on it that many years, but it's been around that long at MRI. And it looked at over 6,000 different chemicals of toxicological concern that, again, anything in the environment that may be a concern. And so there's a few examples. So when I was there in the 80s, the AZT drugs, AIDS was a huge challenge. And so we were asked to help push through the testing that would help get AZT and the others, DDI and DDC, the therapies for AIDS in through the FDA system faster and get them out to the individuals who required those therapies. So it was quite an interesting time. I got a lot of chance to publish and speak at conferences, and then we've done a lot of work also with natural products. So I'll leave that I have some slides later to show some natural products facilities we built. So go to the next slide, please. Again, I mentioned the National Cancer Institute. If you look back in the 70s, President Nixon actually had a big push to cure cancer. And so MRI was there right from nearly the very beginning, and have really worked in two different areas, in chemo prevention and then drug therapies. And so if you go to the next slide, I'll get a little more detail about that. So we've had 3 programs over about 45 history in the National Cancer Institute. The first longest one actually is where we've analyzed, and mostly for the development of drugs for treatment of cancer in what we call the preclinical stages, with toxicology studies with animals like rats and mice and whatnot. And then we've actually worked on the shelf life programs where we're assessing the actual drug formulation for stability for long-term preparations, and as well as in supporting and giving to humans for human clinical trials. But the last part, the centralized human preventive repository, is one of the ones that I'm very proud of, and had a lot of, had a lot to do with getting that program at MRI. We've had it now for, close to 10 years. And that's really where I have, really focused in again, a lot of the research lately, my last part of my career. And so if you go to the next slide, it gives you kind of an example of, what is again, one of the ones that the substances that they're looking at is resveratrol that comes from wine. So MRI has to find ways to actually identify and to procure the drug substance and work with companies to come up with a formulation to make it a drug product. And then that's what is used to it be administered in the human clinical trials, and sometimes they're supporting actual biological sample analysis from those trials. So you can imagine I didn't have any problem doing some of the testing myself with the resveratrol. So, and ask Glenn. Glenn, I think, may like wine a little bit off and on, possibly. So, anyways, you want to move on to the next slide. And another program that I brought on board and worked with some really talented folks, it wasn't me by myself, but was with the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Strokes. And actually, it was under Biden, really had a huge push, to be honest, as a vice president, and initiating what was called the BRAIN program, BRAIN initiative, and advancing basically to advance neurological technologies and treatments. And it was nearly over a $250 million effort pushed back in 2017. And then these recent, again, it's on over 500 different disease-related areas. But you can imagine Alzheimer's is a huge issue, as well as traumatic brain injury. I was watching a kind of a documentary the other night on 60 Minutes where the base in Iraq was bombed by Iranian, huge arms, and I think it was early 2020. And most of those of the 100 or so soldiers that didn't get out of there, almost all of them are suffering from traumatic brain issues. So very important in a variety of ways, environmentally, and especially for our troops. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. I'll just say here that we actually have done a lot of work with viruses and to helping develop vaccines and both safety and efficacy studies. So move on to the next slide. Let me check my time here to see how I'm doing. I don't want to rush, but I also want to make sure we're on time. So in the industrial programs, again, a lot of that had to do with drug development and veterinary products and ag. So the first, if you go to the next slide, this is kind of an easy schematic to understand about the drug development cycle. And the gray bars at the bottom kind of show where MRI has been involved, at least in analytical and synthetic support. And it's really entire spectrum other than the drug discovery area, which I mentioned before. We're not really in the basic research drug discovery sector, but it's amazing all of the interesting things you get involved in that entire cycle. But now going all the way from preclinical to clinical studies in humans, it's a really, you get a lot of really interesting problems thrown at you from a scientific standpoint. So go to the next slide, please. This is just a kind of a compendium of the different types of regulatory rules and whatnot that we have had to, I guess, make sure that we get, I guess, everything in terms of reports and whatnot to submit to the federal agencies for actual approval of products. So I won't get into any details. You've seen some of them look familiar, GLP and GMP, and again, EPA, we do a lot of work for ag companies. So if you want to move to the next slide. So I'm not going to go into, I can't really name the companies that we have actually worked with due to confidentiality agreements, but this gives you an idea of the different types of disease targets that MRI has been involved in, and I've been involved with a lot of them myself. And what happens is, these government agencies are typically collaborating with a industrial small pharma or sometimes large pharma company to help get the basic research, or not the basic, but the preclinical and clinical studies done, because they can't really afford it. And then they'll turn it basically back over to that industrial company. So we get a chance. MRI has been involved all along in the analytics of those different components. So they get to actually work with the actual industrial companies in moving their product forward and getting it out to market. So it's pretty exciting. And I'll just say, take a note of the fact that multiple myeloma is up there, and I'll explain that a little bit later towards the very end of my my talk. So let's go on to the next slide. And so part of that support for the FDA, you have to do things, good GMP, good manufacturing practices. And I'm just gonna note here that I helped in support of the chemo really prevention program, and now supports a variety of other industrial as well as government programs. There was a drug repository that was built, about $4 million investment by our company, which is huge, obviously. And after I left the company, or about the time I left, they decided to name the repository after me, which was very humbling and, you know, kind of, I guess, recognition of the efforts we did to get that facility as well, the programs in there supporting new research efforts with drugs and drug development. So the big freezers there you're seeing, those are -80s. Those are, I can't say for sure, but there may be Pfizer vaccines in there. I'm probably not allowed to say that, but that's there's a huge supply of -80 storage that could help store in the Pfizer vaccine. So let's go to the next slide. Just trying to look at my time here, Jamie, real quick. All right, we got about maybe 5 to 8 minutes. Yeah, 5 minutes. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on vet products. We just worked with companies developing therapeutics for, and like Rimadyl is a good example, an anti-arthritic for dogs. So that was kind of exciting. We do it for Pfizer. Pfizer actually allowed us to use their name. You move to the next slide. You can see these are products that you may recognize that we have supported and getting through the registration process and to market. And the key here is MRI is actually a third party. We're not, we have no stockholders as a not-for-profit. That means a lot to these companies because no one can really buy the results through our third-party validation, our third-party validation analysis. So go to the next slide. And this just as an example, on the next few slides actually will be really show some facilities that I was involved in really propping up. This was a natural product nutritional research center we built, mostly looking at biomass production. Imagine something like switchgrass, which is used as cellulosic feedstock for producing ethanol. That's a great example of what we were trying to research there. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. We'll see this is these are algae, both open and closed algae growth systems that we worked on. And it was probably over 10 years ago now because that was when fuel costs were raising. And so it was something that was of interest and now may actually, under new administration, may find some new traction. Go to the next slide, please. It's another facility that was all involved in building, making microcapsules. You think of the contact tiny time pills, you know, those are microcapsules. So we actually encapsulate solids and liquids and gases. Something like a gas like methyl bromide that's used in the, it's a fumigant in the agriculture industry. Imagine trying to capture gas into a food grade matrix. We were able to get like 2% capture rate in that. So go to the next slide, please. This was just a plant that we built for coating seeds to help in agronomic and horticultural industries, and basically putting a variety of different coating materials on it and to assist in both delivery and as well as growth media. Go to the next slide. Sorry for the quick movement here, but this was a high hazard facility that we got into using and helping support the National Toxicology Program. You see, you can handle up to 55-gallon drums in that facility. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm kind of in the last section here, so I should be able to finish up within around 4 or 5 minutes here. Real quick, before I get into the actual different groups I worked with, I'll relate one story. And my first involvement in the intelligence programs, I was asked to fly to a city in the US, I can't say. I was supposed to meet someone at a hotel. I went in and registered at the hotel and said, are there any messages for me? Nope. Got to my room, and about 5 minutes later, our guy calls and says, hey, this is Lyle. Meet me up front. I'll be in a car waiting for you. So I went down, got in the car, and this guy said nothing for like 5 minutes. I'm like, what is this all about? And all of a sudden, he starts spewing this operational idea, and that was a highly classified program. And I was like, you have got to be kidding me. I was like, it was just wild. And so a good experience of how I, again, got to be involved in something that's, again, was very exciting that unfortunately can't talk a lot about. So next slide, please. as will show, these are the different agencies that I work with. It's obviously there's a picture of me at FBI Quantico. Got a great chance to view and see laboratories and training facilities there. And the XYZ it's just you can make up the letters and imagine who I worked with, and because I can't say because of confidentiality. Next slide, please. I won't go into this, but this is just it's kind of a list of the different types of things we did, which are obviously very, very diverse. And you can imagine some of the wild requests that we got from the government to help with the intelligence community. Next slide, please. So there is one program, drink water, excuse me. I can talk about it. Was for the DoD. This is for the Counter Narco Terrorism Program Office, CNTPO, and they're looking for ways to replace opium poppy crops with other plants that would reduce the ultimately the heroin production coming out of places like Afghanistan and other parts of the world. And you got to remember that the drug sales go directly to terrorist operations typically. So that's why it was of great interest. And go to the next slide. Some of the actual studies that we did where we looked at actually if you were to somehow get wheat into the fields to compete with the poppy growth, you can decrease the latex yield. Here's some examples. And if you see the bottom part, that's just a photo. That's a poppy bulb. And the farmers, they score it. You'll see the gum coming out in the first photo. And then they let it dry and you have the gum. And then they go back and they scrape that off. They can do it several times and then take that gum and then they acetylate it. Well, they don't. It goes to another laboratory somewhere that they find that terrorist drug operations find ways to create a diacetylated morphine that is really just the heroin. So with all that, you can imagine that there might be some interest in some Washington D.C. on the Hill. So if you go to the next slide, just show here's some photos of me in D.C. and I like the photo up in the upper hand right. That's a picture of me and actually Harry Truman's original office in the Senate and a picture of him. I thought that was really pretty cool. And in the center there, that gal is actually, she's the chief counsel for the Senate HHS and Education Committee that appropriates about $200 billion a year. So it was kind of interesting talking to those folks. So just go through the next two slides and I'm just going to kind of wrap it up here. Hopefully that the timing's looking good, Jamie. I get this pictures of colleagues and different companies I worked with. And so on the very last slide, I guess a picture of some apheresis machines that are used for stem cell transplants. And I'm going to tell you real quick. That's what I had 5 years ago this month. And I have what's called multiple myeloma, was diagnosed about 5 years ago. I was on a bad course going into organ failure and fortunately got into fairly quick, rigorous chemotherapy, Revlimid, and then had a stem cell transplant and saved my life. It's amazing that you sit there and you got a port in your chest, peristaltic pumps taking your blood out, you're centrifuging it down, spectrophotometer, not a SPECT 20, but a spectrophotometer that's helping separate the cells and then pumping the other cells and plasma back in your body. It's really pretty interesting as a scientist to see that. So anyways, but I finally about 2 years ago, I walked away because it was very tough. I still take a chemo every day, Revlimid, which is a derivative of thalidomide. Many of you folks may remember thalidomide from years ago, but so now most days, all I do is I pretend to look really busy for my wife's benefit. But all joking aside, I'm here today thanks to my wife and kids and a lot of good friends support. So hopefully I didn't go too quickly there, but I tried to keep it. And so I don't know if there's time for questions, but that's where I am now. I got through pretty much everything I hope to address. So.
Yeah, so there's actually, we're actually moving into a meeting with some faculty. So I think Mike is willing to let people hang around on here. In addition, any students that are really interested in meeting, we have time at 3 p.m. on the same link. And I think Andrew Trelli is meeting with you at 2.
Okay.
Sure, he'd also be welcome. So thank you so much.
All righty.
Appreciate
So I think is it Mike's going to chat with me here right now?
Yeah.
Or
yeah, I'll just hang out, and I think Glenn might stick around, and anyone
Sure.
else anyone else is welcome. It's just sort of informal.
Okay, I'm gonna see if I can get back on and get away from the presentation here. Oh, you'll have to take the presentation off. I forgot. Jamie, she may not be. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, perfect. Sorry, I'm not a Zoom aficionado or whatever. So anyways, but well, Harold, hello. How are you? Good to see you. What is this stuff here? Harold Seifried, folks, is Harry is a guy I worked with for many years. He works for the with the National Cancer Institute and grew up in Franklin, New York. And he actually went to a school that's kind of across the hill called Cornell.
Yeah.
A few years ago.
Yeah, just the other day.
Exactly. So anyways, but yeah, so Mike, I'd be glad to speak with whoever and answer questions, and apologize for a little bit for the delay in getting things on, but my perspective.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate how much you pushed that timing of that doc to get through it.
Well, upstate New Yorkers, we know how to talk fast.
Harry, the one I got a letter from?
Say again?
Yeah.
Harry sent me the letter.
Oh, yeah, Harry, yeah. So yeah, Glenn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was all true.
Oh, you lied.
In fact, I understated it.
Really? You gotta remember, I know this guy.
Well,
Yeah.
the big thing is, you know, if you're not careful and you really say what you think, people think you made it up.
It's true. They do.
I mean, that, you know, that's kind of the problem. So yeah, I did that
I know.
because we sent it in once and then they didn't do an award, and then a couple years later they said, hey, can you do this again? Just verify that you're still you, and we'll use what you said last time. And I said, okay.
Right.
That wasn't too hard.
Yeah, I know. I took care of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mike, thanks a lot for your support. I was, again, very pleased to, humbled, honored, whatever. I can't come up with enough words.
Well, we're thrilled about it, and right back at you. Thank you for your, ongoing support of the department and all that you've done for us. And